So in this video, we're going to be using AJAX to log users in and create user accounts. So the first thing we have to do is create 2 more URLs for our 2 AJAX pages. So in URLs, what we want to do is just create 2 more pages. And of course, we have to change our views. And then we go back to our views, and now we want to create the view for our AJAX page. So we're going to create a view called AJAX signup, and what it does is it creates an instance of a special class called AJAX signup, and that's where we're going to do all of our validation. And it takes a post request because we're going to send a post request. And here is the context. This is where we store all of the variables that we're going to put in our template, and I've just called it AJAX output. And the output is whatever response we're going to send back to the user, and then we render the view, and we're going to just call it ajax.html because all of our AJAX responses are going to look the same. And I just created the AJAX login method so we don't get an error. So now in forms is where I'm going to create this AJAX signup class. So I'm going to paste these includes in. We're going to need these at some point, so I'm just going to paste them in at the beginning, and I'm going to paste this in as well. So what we're going to do is we're including JSON and our regular expression library, and then we have a base AJAX class because our AJAX requests are going to be quite similar, so we want to have a base class that encompasses the core functionality that every single AJAX request is going to have to deal with. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in these functions. So every AJAX request is going to have to deal with errors, success, and items and output. Output is obviously the output. Items is what we send back when our request was successful, but you can see instead of sending back a message, we want to send back data. So we're going to send back raw JSON out of the database, and to do that, we're going to use this items function. Next, what I'm going to paste in is this. So ignore these 2 variables for now. So in our constructor, whenever we create an object on the view, which is when we run this line here, what we want to do is get the arguments out of the post request. We're getting the arguments and we're storing them in this variable here. So the first argument is going to be the data in the post request. If there's more than one argument, there might not always be, but sometimes there will be. If there's more than one argument, the second argument will be the user details. So if the user's logged in, it'll be the details about their username and stuff like that. We want to assign our user variable equal to the second argument. So now we can refer to our user variable, which is how we refer to the user who's logged in. And if they're logged in, they'll have an ID. If they're not logged in, they'll be an anonymous user. They won't have an ID, so we're just going to say user equals NL, which means user equals not logged in. So now I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to implement our AJAX signup. So what we do is we create another class, but you can see the output method runs self.validate, and here is our validate method. And what it does is it grabs the username, the password, and the email out of the request. It goes to arguments and it grabs the username, the password, and the email. And if it can't grab them for whatever reason, then we're going to say there was an exception and the request was malformed, so we're not going to proceed with the rest of the code. This means if somebody modified their page, tried to send a request to create an account without a username or something like that, we would catch that with our malformed request. So the next part I've just pasted in is the rest of this function, and what we do is we run a regular expression and we check if the username meets this expression. So if it contains just letters and just numbers and just underscores, that's all the characters that we're going to allow, and if not, we just say that the username is invalid and we return an error. Then what we do is we check the email. This is just a regular expression that checks the syntax of the email. Then we check the username. We just check the length of it. We see if the length is less than 4 and greater than 20, then the username is either too short or too long, so we tell them that and we return an error. For password, it's the same thing. And for email, we're checking the length as well. The minimum length of a valid email is 6 characters. Then what we do is we use Django's SQL API to query the database. The way it works is we go to our user model, and because that inherits from Django's models, we have access to this objects property. So we check does any row in the database have the same username as the one we've typed in, and we do the same thing for the email. Providing all that checks out, create the new user. The way we do that is we create a new instance of our user object. So what we do is we just set the username field, the password field, and the email field. And the password field is set using Django's special make password method, because Django is going to take care of all of our authentication and things like that. And then we run u.save to store that user in the database, and then we return success account created. Next, we're going to do the login. So the way the login works is exactly the same. We validate the request, make sure it has all the fields it needs, and we do the same regular expression in the email to make sure its syntax is correct. We check the password in the email again, and we check if the email exists, and then we check if the password is correct. And the way we check the password is we use Django's check password function. We pass the password in and we query the database using the email that we've just checked, and we retrieve that password and we check if that password is correct. Then we can log the user in. So to log the user in, what we do is we just extract the user from the database. So to get a user from the database, we just use their email, and we're going to get an array back, so we just get the first element out of that. There only should be one element. So I'm going to replace the AJAX login method with this method. This is the actual one we're going to use. We just create an instance of our AJAX login. This does our validation. We pass the request to it. And here is the output we get whenever we validate everything. So we store those two. So if the logged in user isn't none, so we're going to use Django's login method to log the user in. And then much the same as before, we just store the output in the template. So to use the login function, we're going to have to import this. This is Django's authentication module. So now we've pretty much done everything we need to validate requests. Now what we need to do is create our AJAX template and send our requests from our login page and our create account page. So here's the template for ajax.html. All we do is we print out our output variable, and we have this bar safe just because it's going to encode things incorrectly. So we put this safe in just to tell Django, don't mess with the output, we know it's safe. So inside of our JavaScript folder, I'm going to paste this file in. I'm just going to open it up. The code in this file I just got off the Django website. I'll include it in the description, and we need it to be able to send AJAX requests with Django because this code will include Django's cross-site request forgery token in the request, and we need that, otherwise Django won't be able to process it. So back in our sign up form, what we're going to do is just paste this code in, and I'll explain it. So we're obviously including the JavaScript file we just created there now. And what we want to do when the document is ready, we're going to target this go button, which is just our submit button. So we're just going to give it an ID of go. And when that's clicked, we're going to go to AJAX sign up, which is the page we just created. We're going to send it the username, the password, and the email. And if the response is successful, we're going to send the user to the index page, which is the login page. And if it's not successful, we're just going to print out an error. And the error is just up here. So I'm just going to paste this code in here. This is just the code to print out an error. By default, its display is equal to none, so it's hidden. Before this will work, in the form, we have to include a hidden field for Django's cross-site request forgery. So to do that, we just paste this in. This is just Django's CSRF token. So we're just going to paste this in here to protect against cross-site request forgery. And our project's called InstaPick, not Insta. And just before we can run this, we have to give each of these an ID, username, email, and password. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to sign up. So I'm going to leave the username blank just so that we get an error. Click on that. You can see invalid username was returned, and here is the response from our server. Now I've just put in a valid email, and I'm going to click create account. Now if I refresh, you can see we have a new user, and that user has a password and that user has an email. Next, we're going to try and log in. So logging in is exactly the same. We just paste this in, we send our request, we have to give our submit button an ID of go. We have to give our email an ID and our password and our CSRF token. Because we're using Django to log in, we have to include a last login field in the user model because we're using Django's login module. So we just create a new date time field, and by default it's just going to go to the current time. So we're going to migrate that just to add that new row. And now we're going to try to log in. So you can see the page refreshed, and if I refresh the Django session table, you can see now we have a new session because that user has just been logged in. So that's it for user login and user registration. So that's it for this video. Don't forget to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe. If you have any questions, don't forget to email me at francis@howcode.org. In the next video, we're going to be learning how to upload photos to UploadCare and how to store them in our database. But that's it for this video, and I'll see you next time.